An unexpected letter changed everything. 3 women, living completely different lives, received the same mysterious envelope with the address of a hospital and the words, "You need to know the truth." When they met in the waiting room, their eyes locked, and the world seemed to stop. Each of them felt an uncanny sense of recognition, as if they were looking into a mirror. This meeting would reveal the secrets of their past and change everything forever. What do you think about this story? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to find out how it all ends. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy and unnatural. The faint cries of newborns echoed down the hall, a reminder of the fragile lives that had just entered the world. The father sat at the edge of a worn-out chair in the dimly lit living room, his hands trembling as he ran them over his face. In his lap, 3 small hospital bracelets rested, their tiny engravings, Baby A, Baby B, and Baby C, mocking him with the weight of what he was about to do. He looked toward the small crib by the window, where 3 identical faces lay peacefully, unaware of the storm brewing in his heart. Their tiny hands twitched in their sleep, their breaths soft and steady. He felt like the air was being squeezed out of his lungs. They were his daughters, his blood, his responsibility, but he couldn't see a way forward. Not without her. The memory of that night haunted him. His wife's face, pale and exhausted, as she gave everything to bring these girls into the world. The panic in the doctor's voices. The moment when the machines fell silent, and the reality of her absence crushed him. She was gone, and he was left alone with 3 newborns and a grief that felt impossible to bear. The community offered no solace. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, their words cutting through him like a blade. A single black man, young and already judged by the color of his skin, was now a widower with 3 babies. No one stepped forward to help. Instead, the whispers turned into questions, then accusations. "He can't raise them alone," they said. "He'll fail. It's only a matter of time." At first, he tried to manage, juggling late-night feedings, diaper changes, and his job, but the weight of it all was crushing him. Every cry from the crib felt like a reminder of his inadequacy. Every glance in the mirror showed him a man unraveling, unsure of how to love and protect these girls when he couldn't even hold himself together. One night, after hours of pacing and staring at the photo of his wife on the mantel, he made the decision. It was the hardest choice he would ever make. He would let them go, not because he didn't love them, but because he did. He convinced himself it was the right thing to do, that they deserved more than what he could offer. A home. Stability. A chance at happiness. The next week was a blur of paperwork and gut-wrenching goodbyes. He reached out to families through agencies, ensuring that each daughter would go to a home that promised love and opportunity. He met with strangers who smiled warmly and assured him they would care for the girls as their own. The day of separation arrived too soon. He stood by the car, holding Baby A, then Baby B, and finally Baby C, as each family took their turn. He kissed each tiny forehead, whispered a silent apology, and handed them over, one by one. Each time he let go, it felt like his heart shattered further, the pieces scattering so far he wondered if he'd ever find them again. The last family drove away, and he stood in the empty driveway, the silence unbearable. He looked down at his empty arms, the faint smell of baby powder lingering on his shirt, and felt an ache so deep it threatened to consume him. The house behind him felt hollow now, a shell of what it once was. His daughters were gone, and he was alone with nothing but his guilt and the weight of the decision he would carry for the rest of his life. He never spoke of their mother again. To anyone who asked, he gave vague answers or changed the subject. Her absence was a wound too raw, and the truth of that night felt too heavy to share. Over time, her memory became a ghost that lingered in the corners of his mind, a shadow that reminded him of everything he had lost. Years passed, and the whispers about him faded, replaced by new gossip and new scandals. But he never forgot. Every night, he sat in the same chair, staring out the window, wondering if his daughters were safe, happy, loved. He hoped they would grow up never knowing the pain he felt, never questioning why their lives began with such a heavy silence. What he didn't know was that the silence he created would one day be broken in the most unexpected way. The years crept by, but the weight of that night never left him. The father lived each day with a quiet, relentless ache, haunted by the choices he had made and the memories of what he had lost. The house, once filled with dreams of a bustling family, now echoed with a hollow silence. He had packed away her belongings long ago, carefully folding her favorite dresses and tucking away the photographs they had taken together, but no amount of tidying could erase her presence. It lingered in every corner, in the faint smell of her perfume that still clung to the curtains, in the quiet creak of the floorboards where she used to stand, humming softly to herself. Her name had become a forbidden word, a sacred syllable he could no longer bear to say. The townsfolk didn't ask anymore, but the whispers persisted, spreading like smoke through the community. What kind of man gives away his own daughters? They'd murmur behind his back. Coward, some would spit. A real man would have kept his family together. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting, a constant reminder of his perceived failure. But it wasn't just the whispers that hurt, it was the way people looked at him. The pity in their eyes. The disdain. As a black man in a community where prejudice simmered just below the surface, he was used to being scrutinized, judged for things he couldn't control. But this felt different. Now, he wasn't just a man to be feared or mistrusted, he was a man they saw as broken, weak, a cautionary tale whispered to others, don't end up like him. He kept to himself as much as possible, going to work, coming home, and avoiding unnecessary conversations. Yet even in his solitude, the guilt gnawed at him. He wondered if his daughters ever thought of him. Did they remember his face, his voice? Did they know why he had done it, or did they hate him for abandoning them? Sometimes, late at night, he would sit by the window with a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out at the empty street and imagining their faces. Were they happy? Did they laugh? Did they grow up loved? The truth of their mother's death remained his deepest secret, a story he couldn't bear to tell, not even to himself. He replayed that night in his mind over and over, the sterile smell of the hospital, the beeping of machines, the panic in the nurse's voice as they wheeled her away. He had held her hand as long as they let him, whispering that it would be okay, that they would get through this. But when she was gone, he was left with nothing but silence and the overwhelming responsibility of raising 3 tiny lives without her. He hadn't told anyone the real reason he gave the girls away. He didn't tell them about the nights he lay awake, imagining the future he couldn't give them, the scraped knees he wouldn't know how to bandage, the bedtime stories he wouldn't have the heart to tell, the teenage years he feared would break him. In his mind, the decision had been an act of love, the only way he could ensure they'd have a chance at something better. But the world didn't see it that way. And deep down, some part of him didn't either. The community didn't care about his pain or his reasons. To them, he was a failure, a man who had abandoned his children. They didn't see the nights he spent working overtime to pay off the hospital bills that still haunted him. They didn't see the hours he spent alone in the house, sitting in the nursery that had never been used, staring at the empty cribs. All they saw was what he hadn't done. He tried to block out the whispers, to focus on surviving, but the guilt followed him everywhere. It was in the eyes of the women who avoided his gaze at the market, in the muttered comments of the men at the factory, in the reflection that stared back at him in the mirror each morning. And through it all, the memory of her haunted him. The way she smiled at him before they walked into the hospital, her hand resting on her swollen belly, full of hope for the future. He had promised her they would be okay, that he would take care of everything. But he had failed her, just as he had failed their daughters. As the years passed, the town moved on, their judgment softening into indifference. New scandals and stories replaced his, and the whispers became less frequent. But for him, the pain remained sharp, like a wound that refused to heal. He kept their hospital bracelets tucked away in a drawer, along with a faded photo of her holding the 3 girls in her arms. It was the only photo he had of them together, taken just hours before she was gone. He would take it out sometimes, late at night, and stare at it until his vision blurred. He told himself he had done the right thing. He told himself he had no other choice. But the weight of that choice never lifted. It clung to him, a shadow that darkened every corner of his life. And as much as he tried to bury the past, he knew it was only a matter of time before it came back to him. The 3 sisters, separated at birth, grew up in worlds that couldn't have been more different, their lives shaped by the circumstances of the families that took them in. Though they shared the same blood, their experiences forged paths that would define them in vastly different ways. The eldest, given to a family that prided itself on discipline and order, spent her childhood under strict rules. The household was clean and well-maintained, but warmth was a rarity. Her adoptive parents believed in teaching responsibility through control, and their love was often overshadowed by their demands. As one of the only black children in her predominantly white community, she endured the subtle and not-so-subtle sting of racism. At school, she was constantly reminded of her otherness, classmates whispered, teachers overlooked her achievements, and the stares followed her wherever she went. At home, her parents told her to rise above it, but their words felt hollow. She couldn't escape the feeling that she had to work twice as hard to prove she was good enough. She became fiercely independent, her resilience born out of necessity. But under the surface of her polished exterior, a quiet anger simmered, a question she couldn't answer: where did she truly belong? The middle sister, meanwhile, grew up in a modest home with peeling wallpaper and second-hand furniture. Her adoptive parents were kind but constantly struggling to make ends meet. They loved her deeply, though their affection couldn't shield her from the harsh realities of the world outside their small home. She grew up hearing whispers in the streets, feeling the weight of systemic barriers that seemed designed to hold her back. Despite the warmth in her home, she often felt the ache of wanting more, not material things, but a sense of opportunity, of freedom. Her parents encouraged her to dream big, but even as a child, she recognized the limits imposed by her circumstances. She worked hard in school, excelling where she could, but the opportunities available to others always seemed just out of her reach. Despite this, her spirit remained strong. She developed a quiet determination, the kind of hope that refuses to be extinguished, even in the face of constant disappointment. The youngest sister's life appeared, on the surface, to be the easiest. She was adopted by a well-off family that lived in a large house with manicured lawns and pristine furniture. She attended private schools, wore expensive clothes, and never wanted for anything, at least, not in a material sense. But her home was a cold place, where affection was a privilege rather than a given. Her adoptive parents often treated her as an obligation, a duty they had taken on for appearances rather than out of love. She felt the sting of isolation most deeply. Her schoolmates, predominantly white, often treated her like an outsider, though they disguised their prejudice behind polite smiles. Her parents rarely addressed the subject of race, acting as though ignoring it could erase the discomfort it brought. She learned to suppress her feelings, to smile through the emptiness that gnawed at her. But no matter how much she tried to fit into the mold they had created for her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, a piece of herself she couldn't quite identify. As the years passed, each sister grew into her own, shaped by the challenges and triumphs of their separate lives. The eldest became a force to be reckoned with, driven and unyielding, though the cracks in her armor hinted at the struggles beneath. The middle sister, despite her hardships, carried a quiet warmth that drew people to her, a strength rooted in hope and perseverance. And the youngest, though polished and poised, carried an unshakable emptiness, her search for meaning shaping her every move. None of them knew about the others. None of them could have imagined the shared history that bound them, or the truth waiting to reunite them. Each had grown up believing she was alone in her struggles, unaware that somewhere, two others carried pieces of the same story, waiting to be brought together. The first envelope arrived on a chilly Monday morning, sliding silently through the mail slot in the eldest sister's apartment door. She was already running late for work, buttoning her jacket as she hurried to leave, when the plain white envelope caught her eye. There was no return address, just her name scrawled in uneven handwriting. Frowning, she picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper with an address and 7 haunting words, "You need to know the truth." She stared at it for a moment, her heart quickening. The hospital address was unfamiliar, but the simplicity of the message unsettled her. What truth? Who had sent it? And why now? Shaking off the unease, she stuffed the paper into her bag and hurried out the door. Yet throughout the day, her mind kept returning to the letter. By the time she got home that evening, she had made up her mind, she would go. Miles away, the second envelope arrived in a much humbler home. The middle sister, who had just come back from a long shift at the diner, found it tucked between a stack of bills on the kitchen table. She opened it cautiously, her tired hands smoothing the paper as she read the same cryptic words, "You need to know the truth." Her first instinct was to dismiss it as a mistake, some kind of scam or mix-up. But as she sat there, staring at the address, something tugged at her. A feeling she couldn't quite explain, like a faint echo of something she'd forgotten. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket, her thoughts spinning. By the next morning, she had decided to take the bus to the address. The youngest sister received her envelope in the glossy mail pile her adoptive parents' housekeeper had left on the counter. She almost didn't notice it, sandwiched between catalogs and invitations. But the stark handwriting on the envelope caught her attention. When she opened it and read the message, her first reaction was irritation. "What kind of game is this?" she muttered, tossing the paper onto the counter. But hours later, as she sat alone in her pristine bedroom, the words began to gnaw at her. The truth. It felt personal, like the answer to a question she didn't even know she'd been asking. Against her better judgment, she typed the address into her phone and made a plan to drive there. The hospital waiting room was like any other, rows of uncomfortable chairs, muted colors, and the low hum of chatter and distant announcements echoing through the air. The eldest sister sat stiffly near the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her sharp, discerning eyes scanned the room, but her thoughts were elsewhere, circling around the cryptic letter that had brought her here. She glanced at the clock on the wall, tapping her foot impatiently, willing herself not to second-guess her decision to come. The middle sister entered a moment later, clutching her bag against her chest like a shield. She hesitated at the doorway, her nerves evident in the way she fidgeted with the strap of her purse. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, or someone, that might give her answers. When she spotted the woman by the window, she felt an odd pang of recognition, but she shook it off. Just a coincidence, she told herself as she quietly chose a seat on the opposite side of the room. The youngest sister arrived last, her heels clicking rhythmically against the tiled floor. She carried herself with confidence, her polished exterior giving no hint of the unease bubbling beneath the surface. As she stepped into the room, her gaze swept across the faces of the people waiting, her expression unreadable. Then her eyes landed on the two women sitting at opposite ends of the room, and something inside her shifted. For a moment, none of them moved. Their eyes met, first by accident, then with deliberate focus. The eldest straightened in her seat, her breath catching as she studied the two faces before her. The middle sister froze, her hand tightening around her purse, her heartbeat quickening. The youngest tilted her head slightly, her composed expression faltering as the realization began to take hold. The resemblance was undeniable. The curve of the jaw, the shape of the eyes, the way their brows furrowed in the exact same way. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that couldn't be explained but was impossible to ignore. "Do I know you?" the middle sister finally asked, her voice trembling as she broke the silence. The eldest hesitated, her throat dry. "I don't think so," she said slowly, though her own voice lacked conviction. The youngest stepped forward, her heels clicking loudly in the quiet room. "This is strange," she said, her tone guarded but laced with curiosity. She gestured between them. "We look alike." The middle sister's hand flew to her mouth as if trying to hold back a gasp. The eldest's sharp gaze softened, the realization settling over her like a wave. They sat there for a moment, staring at one another, their minds racing with questions that none of them dared to ask out loud. Before they could speak further, a nurse appeared at the doorway, her expression unreadable as she glanced at the clipboard in her hands. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Are you all here for Mr. Harris?" The three women exchanged startled glances. "Yes," they said in unison, the word tumbling out before they could process it. The nurse smiled faintly, motioning for them to follow her. "Right this way." Their footsteps echoed in the corridor as they followed her down a long, sterile hallway. None of them spoke, but the air between them crackled with unspoken questions and nervous energy. They were strangers in name but not in spirit, and each step brought them closer to an answer they couldn't yet imagine. When they reached the door, the nurse turned to them. "He's waiting for you," she said softly before stepping aside. The hospital room was small, its stark white walls and the steady beep of a heart monitor amplifying the weight of the moment. The three women stepped inside hesitantly, their movements slow and uncertain, as if crossing the threshold might shatter the fragile reality they were about to face. The air was thick with the antiseptic scent of the hospital, but it was the man in the bed who held their attention. He was frail, his dark skin weathered by time and hardship, his frame almost lost within the folds of the blanket. His eyes, sunken but sharp, moved between the three women, lingering on each face as if trying to memorize every detail. There was no mistaking the emotion in his gaze, it was a mixture of sorrow, longing, and relief. "You came," he whispered, his voice rasping as he struggled to speak. His hand trembled as he reached for a glass of water on the side table, but none of the sisters moved to help him. They were frozen, caught between confusion and the unshakable feeling that they were standing on the edge of something monumental. "Who are you?" the eldest asked, her voice sharp but unsteady. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, as if bracing herself for the answer. The man's lips quivered, and he took a shallow breath before replying, "I am your father." The words hung in the air, sinking into the room like a stone into water. The silence that followed was deafening. The eldest blinked, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't decide whether to laugh or shout. The middle sister took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. The youngest simply stared, her face a mask of disbelief. "Sisters," the man continued, his voice shaking. "You are sisters. My daughters." The eldest was the first to speak, her tone sharp and defensive. "No," she said, shaking her head. "This doesn't make sense. This has to be some kind of mistake." "It's no mistake," the man replied, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "I see it in your faces, just as I saw it in hers, your mother's." At the mention of their mother, the middle sister found her voice. "Our mother?" she asked, her words trembling. "Where is she? What happened to her?" The man closed his eyes, his breath hitching as if the weight of the question was too much to bear. "She's gone," he said finally, his voice breaking. "She died, the night you were born." The man's frail hands trembled as he clutched the edges of the blanket, his gaze distant, as though looking back into a night that still haunted him with unrelenting clarity. His voice, hoarse and cracking, broke the silence in the hospital room. "It was supposed to be a joyous day," he began, his eyes glistening with tears. "We'd spent months preparing, imagining the life we were going to build. She was so excited to be a mother, so full of hope. We never thought," his voice faltered, and he took a shaky breath, his chest rising and falling as he fought to continue. "We never thought it would end that way." The sisters stood frozen, their emotions raw as they listened. The middle sister, her fingers gripping the armrest of a chair, couldn't stop the tears streaming down her face. The eldest remained standing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to guard herself from the weight of his words. The youngest sat quietly, her expression unreadable, but her clenched fists betrayed the storm brewing within her. "She was in labor for hours," the man continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The doctor said everything was fine, but I could see the pain in her eyes, the exhaustion. She kept squeezing my hand, telling me to stay with her, that everything would be okay." His lips quivered, and his voice cracked. "She was so brave. Even then, she smiled at me." He paused, his fingers curling into the blanket as he struggled to find the strength to go on. "When the first of you was born," she cried with joy. "Then the second. And finally, the third. You were perfect, tiny, but perfect." He looked at them, his gaze filled with a bittersweet mixture of pride and pain. I thought we'd made it." The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, he seemed unable to continue. Then he spoke again, his voice shaking. "But something went wrong. I saw it in the doctors' faces. They told me she was losing too much blood, that they were doing everything they could. I begged them to save her, but," he stopped, his breath hitching as the memory overtook him. "They couldn't." The sisters stood frozen, their breaths shallow as the weight of his words sank in. He closed his eyes, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I held her hand until the very end. She looked at me, so tired, and said, 'Take care of them. Give them a good life.' And then she was gone." His shoulders shook as silent tears rolled down his face. The middle sister covered her mouth, her own sobs escaping despite her best efforts to hold them back. The eldest's rigid posture softened, and she wiped at her eyes, though she refused to let herself cry openly. The youngest stared at the floor, her face pale, her mind racing with questions she wasn't ready to ask. "I tried," he said after a long pause, his voice filled with anguish. "I tried to do what she wanted. But every time I looked at you, I saw her. I saw what I'd lost. And I wasn't strong enough. I told myself it was for your own good, that you deserved more than what I could give. So I found families that could give you a future, a life I thought I couldn't provide." He lifted his head, his tear-filled eyes meeting theirs. "But I never stopped thinking about you. Not a day went by that I didn't wonder if I made the right choice. The guilt, it's eaten away at me every moment since that night." The eldest finally found her voice, though it was thick with emotion. "You thought we'd be better off without you?" she asked, her tone sharp but trembling. "Do you know what it was like to grow up without answers? Without knowing where we came from?" "I know," he replied, his voice breaking. "I know I hurt you. I know I failed you. But at the time, I thought I was protecting you. You abandoned us," the youngest said quietly, her words cutting like a blade. "You didn't even try." The man's face crumpled, and he nodded, his head bowing under the weight of their accusations. "You're right," he whispered. "I didn't. I was weak. And I'll carry that shame for the rest of my life." The middle sister stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for his. "But you told us now," she said softly. "You didn't have to, but you did." The man looked at her, his expression one of raw vulnerability. "I couldn't take this to my grave," he said. "You deserve to know the truth. Even if you never forgive me, I needed you to know." The sisters exchanged glances, their emotions a tangled mix of anger, sorrow, and a faint, reluctant understanding. They were standing on the edge of something they couldn't yet define, their father's words carving new paths in their hearts. For the first time, they saw the broken man behind the decisions, the grief and guilt that had shaped their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that settles after the raw truth has been laid bare. The sisters stood frozen, their father's words still echoing in their minds. He sat hunched on the hospital bed, his frail hands trembling as he wiped tears from his face. His breathing was shallow, each exhale tinged with exhaustion and remorse. For a moment, none of them spoke. The eldest sister's jaw tightened, her arms crossed defensively as she fought to contain the storm of emotions raging within her. The middle sister wiped at her cheeks, her tears falling freely now, her chest rising and falling with quiet sobs. The youngest stood apart, her fists clenched at her sides, her face unreadable as she stared at the man who had just shattered the foundation of everything she thought she knew. "I'm sorry," their father whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying the weight of decades. "I'm sorry for the pain I caused you. I thought I was doing what was right, but I see now. I see how much I hurt you." His words broke something in the middle sister. She stepped forward, her trembling hands covering her face as she let out a choked sob. "We lost so much," she said, her voice cracking. "We lost each other, we lost her, and you." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, the eldest's icy exterior began to thaw. She uncrossed her arms, her shoulders sagging as the anger that had fueled her for years began to fade into something softer, something that felt dangerously close to vulnerability. The youngest let out a shaky breath, her fists unclenching as she finally looked up, her gaze meeting her father's. "Why now?" she asked, her voice breaking. Why wait so long? Their father's eyes filled with fresh tears, his voice trembling as he replied, because I was a coward. I was afraid. I didn't know how to face you, how to tell you what I'd done. But when I learned my time was running out, I couldn't take this secret with me. You deserved the truth. You deserved more than I gave you. The middle sister knelt by the bed, her hands reaching for his. We needed you, she said, her voice trembling. Even if you didn't think you could do it, we needed you. I know, he whispered, his face crumpling. I failed you. And I'll never forgive myself for that. The eldest stepped forward, her tears finally spilling over. You were all I ever thought about, she admitted, her voice raw. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw pieces of something I didn't understand. I hated you for leaving us, for making us feel like we didn't matter. You mattered, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You've always mattered. You're my daughters, and I've loved you every day of my life, even when I didn't show it. The youngest let out a small, broken sound, and then suddenly, she was moving forward. Her arms wrapped around the middle sister, who was still holding their father's hands. The eldest hesitated for a moment, the years of anger still whispering in her mind, but then she stepped in too, pulling both sisters into her embrace. The three of them stood there, holding each other tightly as their tears flowed freely. It wasn't a perfect reunion, it was messy and raw, filled with grief for the years they had lost and the moments they would never get back. But it was real. It was the first step toward something they hadn't dared to hope for, healing. Their father watched them, his eyes glistening with a mix of sorrow and relief. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't know how to be the father you deserved. The middle sister turned to him, her face streaked with tears. We're here now, she said softly. That's what matters. The eldest nodded, her hand resting on his frail arm. You made mistakes. But we're all here. And that's enough. The youngest, still holding her sisters, stepped closer to him. For a moment, she hesitated, but then she reached out and placed her hand over his. We can't change the past, she said quietly. But we can try to move forward. Their father broke down then, his shoulders shaking as he cried. The sisters moved to his side, wrapping their arms around him as they shared in his grief. For the first time in 2 decades, the wall that had separated them began to crumble. The room felt lighter, as though the weight of the past was finally starting to lift. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other, their tears mingling with the quiet hum of the heart monitor. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was the beginning of something new, a chance to rebuild what had been broken, piece by piece. In that moment, they weren't strangers connected by pain. They were a family. And for the first time, they truly believed they could find their way back to each other. The quiet moments after their reunion gave way to restless nights and unanswered questions. The sisters, though finally together, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their story, more to the forces that had shaped their lives so differently. Each of them had endured struggles that seemed too deliberate to be mere chance, the racial bias that shadowed their achievements, the systemic barriers that limited their opportunities, the unspoken rules of a world that treated them as outsiders. The eldest sister was the first to voice what they were all thinking. Sitting at the kitchen table late one evening, she turned to her sisters and said, "What happened to us wasn't just our father's choice. There were systems in place that made it easier for families like ours to fall apart." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The youngest, who had been scrolling through her phone, nodded thoughtfully. I always wondered why my parents never talked about where I came from. They had money, connections. Why was I the one thing they didn't want to explain? The middle sister, still carrying the emotional scars of her upbringing, leaned forward, her voice trembling with conviction. Maybe it's time we find out. Not just for us, but for her, for our mother. She deserved better, and so did we. The sisters began their journey by diving into hospital records, piecing together the events surrounding their mother's death. What they discovered left them shaken: delayed care during childbirth, dismissive attitudes from medical staff, and a troubling pattern of neglect that disproportionately affected women of color in their community. Their mother's case wasn't an anomaly, it was part of a systemic failure that had been allowed to persist for generations. The eldest took the lead in contacting advocacy groups, her determination fueled by years of pent-up frustration. "This isn't just about us," she said during one late-night phone call. "It's about every family that's been torn apart because the system failed them." Meanwhile, the youngest, with her polished upbringing and knack for navigating social circles, used her connections to gather information on the adoption agencies involved in their separation. What she uncovered was a web of racial bias and unethical practices, where black children were routinely placed in households deemed suitable by outdated and prejudiced standards. The middle sister focused on the personal stories of others who had been affected. She attended community meetings, listened to accounts from other families, and began documenting their experiences. "Our voices matter," she said firmly, her notebook filled with stories that echoed their own. Their pursuit of the truth wasn't without obstacles. Institutions denied them access to critical records, citing bureaucratic red tape. Old acquaintances of their father refused to talk, some out of shame, others out of fear. Even within their community, there were those who believed the sisters should leave the past alone, warning them that stirring up old wounds would only bring trouble. But the sisters refused to be deterred. Every roadblock only strengthened their resolve. "They've silenced us for too long," the eldest said one evening, her voice firm. "We can't let them keep doing it." Their efforts culminated in a public forum, where the sisters shared their story for the first time. The room was packed with people from all walks of life, families who had suffered similar injustices, activists fighting for reform, and even those who had once doubted the sisters' cause. The middle sister took the stage first, her voice steady as she recounted the pain of growing up without answers, of feeling invisible in a world that seemed designed to overlook her. "This isn't just about us," she said, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "It's about every child who's been separated from their family, every mother who's been ignored, every father who's been judged without understanding." The youngest followed, her polished demeanor giving way to raw emotion as she spoke about the systemic racism she had witnessed firsthand. "We were divided by a system that didn't see us as people, but as problems to be solved," she said. "And that system is still here, still breaking families apart." Finally, the eldest stepped forward, her voice ringing with determination. "We may not be able to change the past," she said, "but we can fight for a future where no one has to endure what we did. And we won't stop until that future is a reality." Their words sparked a movement. Communities rallied together, demanding accountability from the institutions that had failed so many. Policies began to change, and new conversations about racial bias and systemic inequality emerged. The sisters became advocates not just for themselves, but for all those who had been silenced. They worked tirelessly, balancing their personal healing with their public fight for justice. Their father, though frail, supported them every step of the way, his remorse transforming into a quiet pride as he watched his daughters turn their pain into power. Through their journey, the sisters found something they hadn't known they were searching for: a deeper connection not just to each other, but to the world around them. They had turned their shared tragedy into a force for change, proving that even the most broken stories could be rewritten with courage and unity. In the end, their fight wasn't just about uncovering the past, it was about creating a future where families like theirs could thrive, where love and justice could prevail over prejudice and division. And as they stood together, stronger than ever, they knew their story was only the beginning. The sun streamed through the windows of their father's modest home, filling the room with a warmth that mirrored the newfound connection between him and his daughters. For the first time in decades, the house wasn't shrouded in silence or haunted by the ghosts of the past. Instead, it was alive with laughter, shared meals, and conversations that stretched long into the night. The sisters had moved past the initial storm of anger and grief, finding in each other not just siblings but allies, women who understood the depth of their shared pain and the strength it took to rise above it. Their father, though weakened by his illness, seemed to grow stronger in their presence. He often sat in his armchair, watching them with a mixture of pride and humility, his heart full as they filled the house with life again. The journey to reconciliation hadn't been easy. There were moments when old wounds resurfaced, when the weight of what had been lost threatened to pull them back into darkness. But each time, they leaned on one another, refusing to let the past define them. Together, they worked to rebuild the foundation of their family, brick by brick, finding strength in their unity. They started small, sharing stories about their lives, the triumphs and struggles they had faced while apart. The eldest talked about her battle with perfectionism, the constant need to prove herself in a world that underestimated her. The middle sister shared how she had found solace in community, turning her hardships into a source of compassion for others. The youngest, who had once been guarded and distant, opened up about the emptiness she had carried and the joy of finally feeling whole. Their father listened intently, his eyes often misting as he realized how much they had endured without him. He apologized again and again, not just for the decisions he had made but for the years he hadn't been there to support them. And though it took time, the sisters began to truly forgive him, not because they forgot the pain, but because they saw the man behind the mistakes. As their bond deepened, the family began to see their story not as a tragedy but as a testament to resilience. They decided to share it with the world, hoping to inspire others who had faced similar struggles. The eldest spearheaded the effort, organizing community events and speaking at forums about the importance of family and the impact of systemic injustice. The middle sister focused on outreach, connecting with other families who had been torn apart by similar circumstances. She spent hours listening to their stories, offering support, and reminding them that healing was possible. The youngest used her platform to raise awareness, writing articles and appearing on panels to shed light on the issues of racial bias and inequality that had shaped their lives. Together, they became a force for change, a family that had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, determined to make a difference. Their story began to spread, touching the hearts of people far beyond their community. Letters poured in from strangers who saw their own struggles reflected in the sisters' journey. Families reached out, seeking advice on how to rebuild after years of separation. Activists and advocates drew inspiration from their courage, using their story as a rallying cry for justice and equality. Even their father, who had once been consumed by guilt and regret, found a renewed sense of purpose. Though his health continued to decline, he spent his days writing letters to his daughters, sharing memories of their mother and offering words of wisdom he hoped they would carry with them. He often said, "You've taught me what love really means, to fight for it, to hold on to it, and to never take it for granted." As the years passed, the sisters and their father built a legacy that extended far beyond their own family. They established a foundation in their mother's name, dedicated to supporting families affected by loss, separation, and systemic injustice. Through scholarships, advocacy, and community programs, they turned their pain into a source of hope for others. On the anniversary of their reunion, they gathered in the same hospital where their journey had begun. Standing side by side, they reflected on how far they had come, not just as individuals, but as a family. "We were broken," the eldest said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But we chose to rebuild. And that choice has made all the difference." Her sisters nodded, their father smiling weakly from his wheelchair. Though the scars of their past would always remain, they had transformed those scars into something beautiful, a reminder of the power of love, forgiveness, and unity. Their story is a powerful example of how even the deepest wounds can heal when we face them with courage and compassion. It reminds us of the importance of family, the strength found in unity, and the need to fight for justice and equality in our communities. What did you think of their journey? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the resilience of the human spirit.